Hello everyone, my name is Lisa Steele. I'm the Artistic Director at V-Tape, and I'm glad to introduce you to Lauren Gabrielle Fournier, whose exhibition Autotheory is at the V-Tape from March 29th through April 23rd. And Lauren, would you give us a little introduction to the overall exhibition, which is comprised of a number of video works?
Sure, yeah, thanks Lisa. So yeah, I'm Lauren. This is Autotheory. Some might recall back in 2018 I curated a screening here called Autotheory, slightly different. It was all one word. This is deliberate, the auto set aside, which I'll talk about shortly. But most simply, this emerges from my ongoing research into this idea of autotheory, or the bridging of autobiography, memoir, embodied subjective modes with theory, philosophy, research, citation, processes of knowledge production. And in contrast to the screening I curated from V-Tape's holdings, this features video and Super 8 converted to video works that I completed from 2019 to 2021 as part of a postdoc that I was doing through the Masters of Visual Studies, through the Visual Studies program at the University of Toronto that Lisa Steele so generously supervised. And so this exhibition is the culmination of some of that research. I returned to the prairies to do this auto-theoretical work. This was pre-COVID-19 pandemic, so I returned thinking that I might spend about 3 immersive months making these works, thinking through some of my guiding questions. My guiding questions being, around settler colonialisms in the context of the prairies of Saskatchewan, thinking about potentially reparative relations between settlers and Indigenous peoples in the context of the prairies of Saskatchewan, questioning what does it mean to be like a critical settler who seeks such modes of repair moving forward, also thinking about what constitutes working class culture, specifically in my case a white settler working class culture raised in Regina, Saskatchewan. So those are some of my guiding questions. Really, what is this culture from which I come? The resulting works that ended up being made for 2 years during the COVID-19 lockdown, all, to my surprise, ended up being centered around cars and trucks. So perhaps there's some like psychoanalytic work that can be done, but I think that these are historically symbols that are quite kind of macho masculine, certain forms of masculinities, quite North American masculinities, and as we'll see inside, symbols that have also taken on new valence and meaning in the past months, of course, with the truck convoy, for example, in Ottawa recently. So that's all to give some context for this work, and yeah,
let's go in and see the show. So Lauren, do you want to just give us an idea what this work is about?
Sure, so this work is Waiting for a Train to Pass. I shot it on an iPhone camera. Part of the process of some of these works, some were staged and some were actually quite improvised. This was a work that was very much spontaneously shot because I was driving in the car with my mother. This was actually right before the pandemic was in view, a couple months before, and we were driving and waiting for a train to pass. Notably, this boundary line that's marked by the train here, this is in Regina, Saskatchewan, coming from the north end, heading south. For those from Regina, you'll know that the boundary line dividing north and south is very charged from a racial, Indigenous, class-based perspectives. There's a quite racist term of being north of Dewdney in Regina, and quite interestingly, there's actually a movement to rename Dewdney Street to a more Indigenous name as part of a way of undoing that legacy. But this boundary line dividing north and south is quite charged because historically in Regina, it's been primarily like a very large Indigenous population living north of Dewdney. And so when this phrase is invoked by white settler populations, there's this very loaded racist undertone. Here we are sitting and waiting for a train to pass. It becomes a bit of a meditation on waiting, on land, this idea of idling, which I will get to with a future work here. And there's this big like oil holding container. There's a billboard advertising an upcoming bridal show. And on the radio just happened to be playing on CBC classical European music in a quite dramatic, operatic way. I found the scene to just have a kind of absurdity to it, and I wanted to capture it, so this is the work that results.
Shall we move to the next work, Lauren?
Sure. So this work is Hay Bale Devotion, or Road Trip Grieving. So this is a bit of a road trip Super 8 film. I made this work when I was in a process of a lot of personal grief and loss. This was also right before the COVID-19 pandemic, so I was making my way to a friend's wedding up in northern Saskatchewan, north of Prince Albert, and I was on a solo road trip. It was quite cathartic, and I only had with me aside from like Tim Hortons coffee, I had my Super 8 film camera and this book, Devotional Cinema. So this work is a bit of a sketch and reflection that follows this trip and my own reflections on land and landscape at this time. One of the tie-ins to the next work we're going to look at is this idea of donuts. So as a kid, when we'd go on road trips through the prairies, I was really fascinated and intrigued by the hay bales, which I call the straw donuts. And so thinking about these marks of farming, agriculture, settler histories and interventions on the land, as they exist alongside or in relation to Indigenous peoples living on the land, and also juxtaposing some research and reading and reflection through this devotional cinema book, and self-imaging and reflection with the land, and thinking about my own relationship and grief. In the context of the road trip part of this video, I should also add that, and I note this in the caption of the film, that the highway that I was driving along is the Louis Riel Memorial Highway, and Louis Riel, for those of you who don't know, is a very well-known Métis leader who was leading the Métis Rebellion and was later killed for those reasons by John A. Macdonald, then Prime Minister of Canada. And so thinking very much as I was driving as a white settler of these very much alive, still living histories of Indigenous and Métis resistance on the land in relation to farming and other such histories.
Okay, let's move to this diptych over here. Which I really like the install of this, the floor mount, as it were.
Yeah, I'm really happy with this install. The propping up of the monitors so generously donated to us here by Dear Reload. The brick was originally like a temporary measure, but it felt very perfect, very parking lot like. So have these sculptural objects, have video and film rendered more sculpturally. So these are two Super 8 films that I shot. One of the earliest images that came to my mind when I was back in the prairies making this work and reflecting on some of the questions that I shared with you earlier was just an image of a car in this particular vacant lot in Regina, in what used to be the Sears Bargain Center in the Value Mall, which I spent a lot of time growing up in, and what people from Regina will be very familiar with it. So the vacant lot behind it, I just had an image of an old car doing donuts. So those of you from more rural places, perhaps from the city, I'm not sure, donuts is when you are driving, you put your car in neutral and it spins in this tight circle. I learned some vocabulary and practices and rituals, thinking of car culture and donuts. Apparently, one thing I learned in making this work is that to do a donut in reverse, which my car performer, my auto performer here, had to, her car wouldn't do the other version. her car was on its last legs, and this was actually its kind of last hurrah, which I appreciated. So basically, to do a donut in reverse is called like whipping a shitty, apparently. So the title of this diptych work is Whipping a Shitty on Idling, parentheses donuts 1 and 2. And so part of this work was thinking about idling, thinking about waiting, thinking about wasting time, and you know, the narratives we often hear of people growing up, say, in a more suburban context, parking lot context. There's a kind of boredom, idling, teenage rebellion, you know, spinning one's wheels, like not really going anywhere. So that was something I was thinking about. As I continued to reflect on that idea in relation to this body of work, I was also thinking about the movement from already a decade ago now, which kind of blows my mind, but of Idle No More, the Indigenous-led movement, which was calling on, you know, the Canadian government, the colonial government, to stop idling, you know, stop wasting time and kind of making Indigenous people wait for such rights as like land-based rights and justice. So that was in my mind too. And it was interesting trying to cast an auto car performer for this. I had some trouble. I actually had to, you know, part of my process was connecting with some of the local communities and networks. So there on Facebook, there was a group called the Regina Car Meetup, I believe, or like car enthusiasts. And so they would post people with classic cars, but people also with all sorts of cars, and kind of any car would do these car meetups in parking lots. And so I posted on there, connecting with some people asking for a performer, but then I swiftly learned that doing donuts is illegal. And so I was, you know, not banned from the platform, but it prompted a really interesting conversation about where can you legally do such a performance, and thinking about private property, vacant lots, etc., which is also very interesting to me.
Okay, let's move to the kind of signature piece of the truck guys.
Sure.
Which is a longer work. It's 35 minutes, I believe, and it is. There is a voiceover performed by you and another character, and accompanied by a lot of observational work. Do you want to just tell us about where this came from?
Sure, yeah. So the premise of this video is interesting because I'm someone who actually hadn't really thought much about conspiracy theories at all. Like, I have some friends who are, you know, like into it or reading on the internet. I never was really interested in it. I always kind of kept my distance from it. But as I was making work and just so happened to be truly actually spending time paused in parking lots, so just to get out of my house during the pandemic, I would drive my car and just, you know, there wasn't often many places to go. So I found myself literally sitting in parking lots. I was thinking about what was then, so this is back in 2020, early days, a growing movement like QAnon and other such conspiracy theories that tended to be associated, you know, not always, but tend to be associated with the alt-right, politically speaking, ideologically speaking. And I was thinking, you know, what would it mean to look at and kind of analyze, do a kind of anatomy, I think it was your language, like an anatomy of a conspiracy theory from within it, and to invert it from within. So, you know, making some generalizations here, but if I were to assume that those who are more affiliated with the alt-right are the ones driving like big pickup trucks, for example, I was like, okay, what would it mean, you know, if there was a conspiracy theorist, a young woman who was convinced that there is a secret network of pickup truck drivers who are responsible for all of the world's ills. And so, of course, here I'm using the rhetoric of a lot of conspiracy theories, the idea of othering a group and saying, you know, all of the problems of the world can be pinned on this one group or this one person, and that's often the logic that fuels conspiracy theories. So I took up that rhetoric and that logic, and I embodied it, however creepily, to kind of re-perform it in this context. So all of the dialogue is improvised. That was a very new thing for me too. I feel like I'm someone who often has to like write everything out and plan everything out. but it was a cool experience to just sight responsively, embodied, sit and just say whatever was coming if I was trying to get into this person's head. And this video, as Lisa mentioned, it's the longest work in, so it takes a bit of a commitment. It's 35 minutes, including the concluding caption, kind of music video portion. But it is a narrative, so I do encourage viewers to view it from beginning to end. And we are in the first opening scene here right now, because you do follow the journey of this conspiracy theorist who starts to have dialogue with and receives intel from a recovered, reformed truck guy. So someone who used to be in this network and no longer is, so they have these phone conversations. He's kept anonymous. And yeah, you follow this person's journey as they wrestle with their desire to do something about what they're perceiving as a threat of violence, and to move on and live their life with the knowledge that they now possess. And so there is humor, perhaps some creepiness. It's a parafictional work, so that's something maybe the last thing I'll note is this is a work of parafiction. My first work of parafiction, my first time ever exploring it, so that was really fun. Parafiction meaning when an artist or writer presents fiction as fact. So artists like Waleed Rob would be like, big influence there, Jean Randolph, other people who play with those strategies. But then earlier this year, the truck convoy happened, which was really interesting and kind of startling for me, knowing that this exhibition was going to be opening in the spring and realizing that, okay, all of a sudden this feels very on the nose. So that involved me to somewhat have to not necessarily recontextualize the work, but reflect on it in light of this new reality and think about, how does my work operate in the symbolic, somewhat, hopefully humorous, critical commentary that I'm wanting to provide, while also thinking about present day social issues and urgencies when it comes to social division, when it comes to increasing polarization on ideological grounds, and other such problems that I think are, we are facing today. So yeah, those are some of the main ideas behind this work.
Well, I thank you, Lauren, and I encourage everyone to come in and see the show for themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.